The November winds wailed across the moors surrounding Ashbourne Hall, carrying with them the first bitter whispers of winter. Within its stone walls, Edmund Valehurst, the 8th Duke of Ashbourne, sat alone in his dimly lit bedchamber, his gaunt face illuminated by the feeble glow of a dying fire. 4 years had passed since he had buried his duchess, yet the hollow ache in his chest remained as fresh as newly turned earth. "Sell your flowers elsewhere, girl. Our market keeps no pity for your kind." The memory of those cruel words, his words, returned to haunt him as he gazed vacantly at the portrait of his late wife. How easily cruelty had replaced kindness in his heart. The accident that followed had been his punishment, a divine retribution that had left his body as broken as his spirit. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. His sister, Lady Miriam Valehurst, entered without waiting for his permission, her face a portrait of composed determination. "Edmund, this cannot continue," she declared, moving to open the heavy curtains. Weak afternoon light spilled into the room, revealing its neglected state. "You have refused the physician thrice this month. The servants whisper that you are but a ghost haunting these halls." "Let them whisper," he replied, wincing as he shifted in his armchair. The pain in his leg, broken in the carriage accident, had become his most faithful companion. "I require nothing from them." Miriam approached him, her blue eyes softening with concern. "Even solitude requires nourishment, brother. I have taken the liberty of engaging someone to attend you during your convalescence." The Duke's face darkened. "I will not be prodded and pitied by another country doctor who—" "Not a doctor," she interjected. "A widow of good standing. Mrs. Helena Grey has experience in caring for the injured and infirm. The vicar speaks highly of her discretion." "A nursemaid?" Edmund scoffed, though his indignation lacked its former vigor. "I am not a child, Miriam." "No," she agreed. "You are a man who has forgotten how to live. She will arrive this evening, and I expect you to receive her with the dignity befitting your station." Before he could protest further, Miriam placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "One night, Edmund. That is all I ask. One night of care, and if you still wish to wallow in darkness afterward, I shall not interfere again." The Duke remained silent, his pride warring with exhaustion. At last, he gave a curt nod, and Miriam withdrew, leaving him to his solitude once more. As dusk descended, Edmund heard the distant sound of carriage wheels on gravel. From his window, he observed a modest figure alight, carrying but a single valise. The sight stirred an unexpected curiosity within him. What manner of widow would venture alone to care for a man known throughout the county as the Ghost Duke? Mrs. Eleanor Grey was ushered into his chamber an hour later. She stood in the doorway, illuminated from behind by the corridor lamps, her face in shadow. Edmund straightened in his chair, suddenly conscious of his dishevelled appearance. "Your Grace," she greeted him, her voice low and melodious. She stepped into the light, revealing a woman of perhaps 29 years, her brown-grey hair neatly arranged beneath a simple cap. Her grey eyes met his without timidity, yet without presumption. "Mrs. Grey," he acknowledged stiffly, "my sister has greatly exaggerated my need for assistance." "Perhaps," she replied, setting down her valise. "Yet here I am." With calm efficiency, she moved about the room, lighting additional lamps, adjusting his pillows, preparing a tray of medicaments. "I am not an invalid," he protested as she poured a measure of laudanum. "Indeed not, Your Grace. You are a man in pain." She offered him the draught. "This will ease your discomfort." Reluctantly, he accepted. Her fingers brushed his as she handed him the glass, and he noted their unexpected warmth. "How long has it been since you slept without this darkness for company?" she asked, indicating the heavy drapes and somber furnishings. "Sleep and I are but nodding acquaintances, Mrs. Grey." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she moved to the fireplace, stirring the embers and adding fresh logs until the flames leaped high, casting dancing shadows across the walls. "There," she said, turning to face him. "Now we may at least see one another clearly." In the renewed light, Edmund studied her properly for the first time. Her features were not remarkable in their beauty, yet there was a tranquility in her countenance that struck him. She wore her widowhood not as a badge of sorrow, but as a quiet dignity. "What did my sister tell you of me?" he asked abruptly. "That you were a man of noble bearing who had suffered greatly," she answered, "and that your heart had closed like a book whose ending was too painful to bear." The clock struck 10, and Edmund felt the laudanum beginning to take effect. As his eyelids grew heavy, Mrs. Grey took a small volume from her valise and seated herself in the chair opposite his. "Would you object if I read aloud?" she asked. "I find words often bridge the silence when sleep proves elusive." Before he could reply, her voice filled the chamber, reciting verses of compassion and healing. Edmund closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen more intently, and for the first time in years, the ghost of a duke remembered how peace sounded. The door opened. Not to her. Sir Alaric Thornwell stood in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning light. His presence, unannounced and unwelcome, filled the chamber with an air of calculation barely concealed by the polite smile that played across his thin lips. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," he said, eyes flickering momentarily to Mrs. Grey, who had risen from her chair beside the Duke's bed. "I was unaware you had company." Edmund Valorhurst struggled to sit upright, acutely conscious of how this tableau might appear, the widow having maintained her vigil through the night, her book of verses now closed upon her lap, her cap slightly askew from the long hours of reading. "Sir Alaric," he acknowledged coldly, "you forget yourself. The hour is unconscionably early for business matters." The estate manager bowed, his carefully arranged features betraying nothing. "Indeed, Your Grace. Lady Miriam mentioned a new arrangement for your care, but I had not realized it would commence so promptly. I merely wished to inquire after your health." "My health," Edmund replied, "is not the province of estate managers, but of physicians, and now it seems of Mrs. Grey." Eleanor gathered her shawl about her shoulders, the picture of quiet propriety. "I shall leave you gentlemen to your discussion," she said, moving toward the door. "No," Edmund commanded, with more force than he had mustered in months. "Sir Alaric was just departing. The ledgers will wait until the appropriate hour." A flash of displeasure crossed the manager's face before his mask of deference returned. "As you wish, Your Grace. Mrs. Grey," he added with a slight inclination of his head, "welcome to Ashbourne Hall." When the door closed behind him, a heavy silence descended upon the room. Eleanor returned to her chair, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "He does not approve of my presence," she observed. "Sir Alaric approves of little that does not advance his own interests," Edmund replied. "He has administered my affairs since my accident, competently if somewhat overzealously." "I see." Eleanor smoothed her skirts, her grey eyes thoughtful. "And does his zealousness extend to reporting on your domestic arrangements?" A humorless laugh escaped the Duke's lips. "You perceive much, Mrs. Grey. Indeed, Sir Alaric considers himself the guardian of Ashbourne's reputation as well as its finances. No doubt by midday the servants' hall will be abuzz with speculation about your presence." "I am accustomed to speculation, Your Grace," she said simply. "Widowhood invites curiosity, and service invites judgment. Neither concerns me unduly." For the first time, Edmund regarded her with genuine interest rather than mere tolerance. "You speak with remarkable equanimity for a woman in your position." "My position?" The faintest smile touched her lips. "I am a widow who reads to an injured nobleman. What position could be more circumspect?" The morning light now fully illuminated the chamber, revealing its neglect. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, and the once elegant furnishings showed signs of disuse. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, drawing back the heavy curtains to reveal the formal gardens beyond, their geometric patterns blurred by autumn's decay. "Your sister mentioned that you once took pleasure in these gardens," she remarked. Edmund's face darkened. "I took pleasure in many things once. And now? Now I find greater solace in absence than in presence." She turned from the window to face him directly. "Even the absence of pain, Your Grace." Before he could formulate a reply, there came another knock. This time it was a housemaid bearing a tray of breakfast. She entered hesitantly, her eyes downcast, clearly uncertain of the protocol for serving a master who had become virtually a recluse. "Set it there," Eleanor directed gently, indicating a small table. The girl complied, stealing curious glances at both the Duke and his attendant before hurriedly departing. "You see," Edmund gestured at the closed door, "even my own servants regard me as some sort of curiosity, a noble oddity to be whispered about below stairs." "They fear only your displeasure," Eleanor replied, pouring a cup of tea with steady hands. "It is a natural consequence of isolation. The unknown always inspires trepidation." She approached his bedside, offering the steaming cup. "Will you take this, or shall I continue to be the only one sustaining myself in this chamber?" A reluctant admiration stirred within him at her gentle but unmistakable challenge. He accepted the cup, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. Again he was struck by the warmth of her hands. How could one who seemed so serene radiate such heat? "You did not answer my question, Mrs. Grey," he said after taking a sip. "About your equanimity. in the face of speculation. Eleanor seated herself once more, her own tea cradled between her palms. When one has lost what I have lost, Your Grace, the opinions of others become as insubstantial as morning mist. They may obscure the view momentarily, but they cannot change the landscape beneath. And what have you lost? The question escaped him before propriety could intervene. Her eyes met his, clear and unflinching. A husband to war, a son to fever, a future to circumstance. The simplicity of her statement, devoid of self-pity, struck him with unexpected force. Here was suffering equal to his own, perhaps greater, yet she sat before him not as a spectre of grief, but as a living woman, composed and present. And yet you continue, he observed. As do you, Your Grace, she countered, though you may prefer to consider it mere existence. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but charged with mutual recognition. For the first time in years, Edmund felt seen, not as the tragic figure of local gossip, nor as the failed protector of his late wife, but simply as a man in pain, both physical and spiritual. "Will you read again?" he asked suddenly, surprising himself with the request. A gentle smile transformed her face, lending it a luminosity he had not observed before. "Of course." She retrieved her book, opening to where they had left off the previous night. Her voice, melodious and clear, filled the chamber once more with words of healing and hope. Edmund closed his eyes, not to shut out the world as had become his habit, but to better absorb the cadence of her speech, the subtle music of vowels and consonants shaped by her lips. When she paused to turn a page, he opened his eyes to find her watching him, a question in her gaze. "Continue," he urged softly. "Please." And so she did, while outside the window a solitary bird began to sing, its voice joining hers in an unexpected duet that seemed to Edmund like the first notes of a forgotten melody, the sound of something long buried beginning, against all odds, to stir once more. The wax was red, the crest unmistakable. The letter lay upon the silver salver, its scarlet seal glinting in the afternoon light. Lady Miriam held it toward her brother with an expression that mingled concern with resolute purpose. "It arrived this morning," she explained. "Addressed to you personally, the messenger awaits your reply." Edmund regarded the missive with undisguised wariness. The emblem pressed into the wax, a falcon with outstretched wings, belonged to Thomas Hale, his childhood companion, and the only man who had stood by him during the dark days following his wife's passing. Yet 4 years had elapsed since their last communication, a silence born not of animosity, but of Edmund's relentless withdrawal from all society. "You need not hover, Miriam," he said, accepting the letter with reluctance. "I am neither an invalid nor a child requiring supervision." His sister's lips thinned. "No, indeed. Mrs. Gray assures me your physical recovery progresses admirably. It is your spirit that remains infirm." A week had passed since Eleanor Gray's arrival at Ashbourne Hall, a week during which Edmund had found himself increasingly reliant upon her calm presence and melodious voice. Each evening, she read to him from volumes of poetry and philosophical discourse. Each morning, she supervised his halting attempts to strengthen his injured leg through measured exercise. Her ministrations, professional yet somehow intimate, had awakened in him sensations long dormant, curiosity, anticipation, and most unsettling of all, pleasure in another's company. "Where is Mrs. Gray this afternoon?" he inquired, attempting to sound merely conversational. "I believe she is taking the air in the East Garden," Miriam replied, a knowing gleam in her eye. She expressed interest in the medicinal herbs once cultivated there. I took the liberty of showing her the old physic garden. Edmund broke the seal, unfolding the parchment with fingers that betrayed a slight tremor. Thomas's bold handwriting leaped from the page. "My dear Valorhurst, rumours of your continued seclusion reach me even in distant Northumberland. While I have respected your desire for solitude these many years, I find I can no longer abide by it in good conscience. I write to inform you of my imminent arrival at Ashbourne, where I intend to remind you by force if necessary, that you remain among the living. Expect me on Thursday next. Have your cook prepare those excellent partridge pies she was once famous for, as I shall arrive with an appetite sharpened by concern for an old friend." With unwavering regard, Thomas Hale Edmund refolded the letter, a complex emotion rising within him, part irritation at the presumption, part reluctant gratitude for this persistent friendship. "Well," Miriam prompted, "will you receive him?" "It appears I have little choice in the matter," Edmund replied dryly. Thomas announces rather than requests his visitation, as has always been his way. A smile touched Miriam's lips. His forthright nature may be precisely what this household requires. Ashbourne has been too long wrapped in silence and shadow. Edmund did not respond, his thoughts turning instead to how Eleanor might perceive this intrusion from his past. Would she withdraw to the background, her role as caregiver diminished by the presence of his oldest friend? The prospect disturbed him more than he cared to admit. "I shall inform Mrs. Winters to prepare the blue chamber," Miriam continued, referring to the housekeeper. "And perhaps instruct cook regarding those partridge pies." "As you wish," Edmund conceded, his attention already drifting toward the window that overlooked the east garden. Though I doubt Thomas would notice their absence, his appetite was ever more theoretical than actual. Left alone, Edmund rose from his chair with greater ease than he would have managed a week prior. Eleanor's gentle insistence on daily movement had yielded results, reducing both pain and stiffness. He moved to the window, supporting himself with a finely carved ebony cane, and gazed out upon the formal gardens below. There she was, a solitary figure among the neatly trimmed hedges, her grey dress a subdued note against the autumnal foliage. She knelt beside a bed of herbs, examining the plants with careful attention, occasionally selecting a leaf or stem and placing it in the small basket at her side. The simple domesticity of the scene stirred something within him, a yearning not for passion, which he had long ago consigned to memory, but for the quiet intimacy of shared purpose. A discreet cough from the doorway interrupted his contemplation. He turned to find Sir Alaric Thornwell regarding him with that particular blend of deference and calculation that had become the manager's hallmark. "Your Grace," Thornwell began, his voice smooth as polished marble, "I trust you are feeling improved today." "Indeed," Edmund replied shortly. "Was there something particular you required, Sir Alaric? I believe our meeting regarding the tenant farms is not scheduled until tomorrow." Thornwell stepped further into the room, a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. "A small matter has arisen that I thought might interest you. In reviewing the household accounts, I noticed certain irregularities." "Irregularities?" Edmund's brow furrowed. "Speak plainly, man." "It concerns Mrs. Grey," Thornwell said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I took the liberty of making inquiries regarding her background. Prudence dictated such action, given her proximity to your person and the sensitive nature of her position within the household." A cold anger began to simmer in Edmund's chest. "I was not aware that my sister's hiring decisions required your scrutiny, Sir Alaric." "Not scrutiny, Your Grace, merely due diligence." Thornwell withdrew a document from his portfolio. "Mrs. Grey's husband was indeed lost in the Crimea, as she claims. However, the circumstances of her subsequent employment raise certain questions. Before arriving at Ashbourne, she served briefly in the household of Lord Blackwood, a gentleman whose reputation for unorthodox domestic arrangements is well documented." Edmund's hand tightened upon the handle of his cane. "You overstep, Sir Alaric. Mrs. Grey came to us with the vicar's recommendation." "Indeed," Thornwell persisted, "and I would not presume to question the vicar's judgment. I merely suggest that a widow of limited means might be susceptible to influences that compromise her discernment. Lord Blackwood's household dismissed her under circumstances that remain unclear." Before Edmund could respond, a soft voice interjected from the doorway. "They dismissed me, Sir Alaric, because I refused to administer laudanum in quantities that would render Lord Blackwood insensible to pain, but also to reason." Eleanor stood on the threshold, her basket of herbs on her arm, her grey eyes steady despite the flush that had risen to her cheeks. How much of their conversation she had overheard was unclear, but her composure in the face of insinuation impressed Edmund even as it fueled his anger at Thornwell's presumption. "Mrs. Grey," the manager acknowledged with a slight bow, "I meant no offence. As His Grace's representative in business matters, I am merely—" "You are merely exceeding the bounds of your authority," Edmund interrupted coldly. "Mrs. Grey's qualifications have been established to my satisfaction. I suggest you direct your investigative energies toward the estate's legitimate concerns, rather than the personal histories of those in my household." Thornwell's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched near his jaw. "As you wish, Your Grace. I shall withdraw the matter from consideration." He replaced the document in his portfolio and bowed stiffly. "Until tomorrow, then, for our scheduled discussion." When he had gone, a tense silence filled the room. Eleanor remained by the door, her expression unreadable. "I must apologize for Sir Alaric's impertinence," Edmund said at last. He forgets that discretion applies not only to financial matters, but to personal ones as well. There is no need for apology, she replied quietly. His suspicion is natural if misplaced. A widow who tends to noblemen's health invites speculation. I have grown accustomed to it. That you should have to grow accustomed to such treatment is itself an indictment of our society's failings, Edmund observed bitterly. A small smile touched her lips. Now you sound like the man your sister describes, the one who once championed the causes of those less fortunate. Edmund turned away, discomfited by her perception. That man exists now only in Miriam's charitable memory. I think not, Eleanor countered gently. He merely slumbers, awaiting the proper moment to awaken. She approached, setting her basket upon a side table. The herbs within released their fragrance. Lavender, thyme, rosemary, filling the air with the scent of growing things. For your leg, she explained. An infusion to reduce inflammation when applied as a compress. Their eyes met, and Edmund was struck anew by the quiet strength in her gaze. Not pity, not the clinical detachment of a physician, but something rarer, recognition. She saw him not as the broken duke, nor as the man he had once been, but as he was in this moment, suspended between past and future, between despair and the first tentative stirrings of hope. I received a letter today, he said abruptly, from an old friend who intends to visit. Thomas Hale, we were at university together. I see. Her hands busied themselves with arranging the herbs. And does this prospect please you? Edmund considered the question honestly. I hardly know. Thomas knew me before. He will expect to find some remnant of that man, and will he? The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its simple phrasing. Edmund found himself unable to answer, caught between the truth he had accepted, that his former self was irretrievably lost, and the unsettling possibility that Eleanor's presence had begun to challenge that certainty. I suppose we shall discover that together, he replied at last. She nodded, accepting his equivocation without pressing further. Then I shall ensure you are prepared to receive him properly. The first reunion after long absence should be an occasion for comfort, not strain. As she spoke, she removed her gardening gloves, revealing hands that, while hardly aristocratic, possessed a grace that belied their capability. Edmund found his gaze fixed upon them, remembering their warmth when they had touched his during the passing of the teacup, imagining them preparing the herbal compress, steady and sure in their purpose. Your friend's arrival may provide a welcome diversion, Eleanor continued, unaware of his scrutiny. Convalescence is as much a trial for the spirit as for the body. And what of you, Mrs. Gray? Edmund asked suddenly. Does your spirit require diversion as well? The question surprised her. He could see it in the momentary widening of her eyes. I find sufficient occupation in useful service, Your Grace. The diversions that might once have entertained me now seem insubstantial. Because of your losses, he said, understanding immediately. Yes, she met his gaze directly. As with yours. In that moment of mutual recognition, something shifted between them. A barrier lowered, a distance diminished. Not through words of passion or grand gestures, but through the simplest acknowledgement of shared experience. The clock struck the hour, breaking the spell. Eleanor gathered her basket once more, the consummate professional resuming her duties. I shall prepare the infusion before dinner, she said, and perhaps if you are not too fatigued, we might attempt a slightly longer walk tomorrow. The library corridor would provide both distance and diversion. Edmund nodded, finding himself reluctant to see her go. Until dinner, then. She curtsied and withdrew, leaving behind the lingering scent of herbs and the unsettling awareness that for the first time in years he anticipated the hours ahead rather than merely enduring them. He did not curtsy. He held his gaze. Thomas Hale arrived at Ashbourne Hall on a Thursday afternoon, heralded not by the sombre formality Edmund had expected, but by the sound of laughter echoing through the entrance hall. From his position in the library, where he had stationed himself partly to demonstrate his improved mobility and partly to avoid appearing too eager, the Duke listened with mixed emotions as his old friend's voice rose above the murmur of servants receiving him. Surely that cannot be young Jenkins. The last time I visited you scarcely reached the doorknob, and now you tower over it like an oak. Edmund smiled despite himself. Thomas had always possessed the gift of putting others at ease, regardless of their station. It was a quality that had once balanced Edmund's own more reserved nature, the two friends complementing each other like adjacent pieces in life's complex puzzle. The library door opened, and Thomas stood framed in the entrance, his broad shoulders filling the space with a vitality that made the room's somber furnishings appear suddenly faded by comparison. His face, tanned by outdoor pursuits and creased with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, broke into a wide grin at the sight of his oldest friend. "Valorhurst, by God, you're vertical. Your sister's letter led me to expect a bedridden wraith, but here you are, standing among your beloved books like a scholar merely interrupted in his studies." Edmund moved forward, leaning only slightly on his cane. "Thomas, you look disgustingly healthy as usual." They clasped hands, and Edmund found himself unexpectedly moved by the familiar strength in his friend's grip. Thomas's eyes, warm with genuine affection, surveyed him critically. "And you look considerably less cadaverous than I had feared," Thomas declared, "though still too pale by half. What you need is fresh air and proper exercise." "What I need," Edmund replied dryly, "is fewer people prescribing what I need." Thomas laughed, the sound rich and unrestrained. "Still prickly as a hedgehog, I see. Some things at least remain unchanged." He moved further into the room, surveying the shelves with a practiced eye. "Though your library appears to have acquired several new volumes since my last visit, I trust Gibbon and Tacitus continue to occupy places of honor?" "They do," Edmund confirmed, watching as Thomas ran a finger along the spines of several ancient tomes, "though I confess they have remained largely undisturbed of late." "Ah," Thomas nodded sagely. "Replaced in your affections by more contemporary companions, perhaps." Something in his tone caused Edmund to stiffen. "If you refer to Mrs. Gray—" "I refer to nothing and no one," Thomas interrupted smoothly. "Merely making conversation, old friend. Though now that you mention the lady, your sister speaks quite highly of her. A capable nurse, an engaging reader, I understand?" Edmund studied his friend's face for any trace of mockery, but found only genuine interest. "She has been most beneficial to my recovery." "I am glad to hear it." Thomas settled himself into one of the library's leather armchairs with the ease of long familiarity. Isolation breeds its own peculiar afflictions, as I've often observed in my northern estate. The Scottish Highlands may be magnificent, but their emptiness can hollow a man from within. Before Edmund could respond, a discreet knock sounded at the door. It opened to reveal Eleanor, a tea-tray balanced expertly in her hands. She paused upon seeing the two men, her expression momentarily uncertain. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. I was not aware your guest had arrived." "Mrs. Gray," Edmund acknowledged, suddenly conscious of how her presence altered the atmosphere of the room, lending it a domestic tranquility that had been absent during his years of isolation. "Allow me to present Mr. Thomas Hale, my oldest and most persistent friend." "Thomas, Mrs. Eleanor Gray." Thomas rose immediately, executing a bow of perfect courtesy. "Mrs. Gray, I am delighted to make your acquaintance. Lady Miriam has informed me of your invaluable service to my friend's recovery." Eleanor set down the tray and curtsied, her movements graceful despite the simplicity of her grey dress. "You are most kind, Mr. Hale, though I believe His Grace's improvement owes more to his own determination than to any assistance of mine." Thomas's eyes twinkled with appreciation for her modesty. "Determination has indeed always been one of Valorhurst's distinguishing qualities. Some might call it stubbornness, but we who know him best recognize it as perseverance." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips, an admirable trait when directed toward worthy goals. "Precisely," Thomas exclaimed, "which is why I have come, to ensure that his perseverance is properly channeled toward complete restoration, rather than toward perfecting the art of melancholy." Edmund cleared his throat, uncomfortable with being discussed as though he were not present. "If you two have quite finished dissecting my character, perhaps we might enjoy the tea before it grows cold." Eleanor immediately moved to pour, her hands steady as she prepared each cup according to preference, a dash of milk for Edmund, 2 sugars for Thomas, as though she had been serving them both for years, rather than meeting one for the first time. "Will you join us, Mrs. Gray?" Thomas inquired politely. Edmund observed a moment's hesitation cross her features, the subtle calculation of propriety versus kindness that governed so much of social interaction. "I thank you, Mr. Hale, but I have preparations to make for His Grace's evening treatment." She handed each man his cup with graceful efficiency. "Perhaps another time." "I shall hold you to that promise," Thomas replied cheerfully. "I am most eager to hear more of your methods. I have a tenant in Northumberland with a similar injury who might benefit from your knowledge." As Eleanor withdrew, Edmund caught Thomas watching her departure with thoughtful interest. The moment the door closed, his friend turned to him with raised eyebrows. "Well, well," Thomas said softly, "I begin to understand Lady Miriam's confidence in your recovery." Edmund frowned. Meaning? Meaning, my dear Valahurst, that Mrs. Gray appears to be exactly what the physician should have ordered years ago, a woman of sense, composure, and evident capability, whose presence alone seems to have improved your colour and posture remarkably. She is my nurse, Thomas, not my— Edmund broke off, uncertain how to complete the sentence without inviting further speculation. Not your what? Thomas leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. Your companion? Your friend? Your equal in suffering? For I observed the widow's weeds and the shadow in her eyes, Edmund. She is no stranger to loss. Edmund set down his cup with more force than intended. Her circumstances are not a matter for discussion. No? Thomas settled back in his chair. Then let us discuss yours instead. 4 years you have languished in this mausoleum of memories, living neither in the present nor truly honouring the past. What would Catherine say if she could see you thus? The mention of his late wife's name struck Edmund like a physical blow. Do not presume to speak for her. Someone must, Thomas replied quietly, for she would never have wished this half-existence upon you. She loved life too well. A tense silence fell between them. Outside the library windows, the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet. I did not come to quarrel, Edmund, Thomas said at last. I came because despite your best efforts to forget it, there remains a world beyond these walls, a world that continues to turn, to change, to offer possibilities you cannot imagine from within your self-imposed exile. Edmund traced the pattern on his teacup with one finger, struggling to articulate the complex emotions that had governed his seclusion. It is not exile, Thomas. It is preservation. Of what? Thomas challenged gently. Memories fade whether we sequester them or not. Pain dulls or transforms, regardless of our efforts to maintain it. Some wounds do not heal, Edmund countered, his voice low. Perhaps not, Thomas conceded, but they need not define one's entire existence. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. I have not come to drag you back into society, Edmund, merely to remind you that you are still a part of it, whether you choose to engage or not, and perhaps to suggest that in Mrs. Gray, you have found a bridge between your isolation and rejoining the world, should you have the courage to cross it. Edmund opened his mouth to object, then closed it again. Had he not, in recent days, found himself anticipating Eleanor's company with something approaching pleasure? Had he not begun to measure time, not by the endless succession of empty hours, but by the intervals between her visits to his chambers? You presume a great deal, he said finally. Presumption is the privilege of old friendship, Thomas replied with a smile. Now, shall we speak of more immediate matters? I noticed as I arrived that your southern pasture appears woefully neglected. The drainage ditches require attention before winter sets in properly. The abrupt change of subject was so typical of Thomas that Edmund could not help but respond with a reluctant smile. Ever the practical farmer, despite your gentleman's education. Land speaks a universal language, my friend. One would do well to listen. As they settled into a discussion of estate management, Edmund found a portion of his mind lingering on Thomas's earlier words. A bridge between isolation and the world? The metaphor was apt, perhaps more so than Thomas realized, for in Eleanor's quiet presence, Edmund had indeed begun to sense a pathway back to something he had thought forever lost. Not happiness, perhaps, but at least a kind of peace. Yet bridges could be crossed in either direction, he reflected soberly, and some, once traversed, allowed no return to former shores. The knock came, 3 times. The following morning dawned clear and cold, a pale November sun casting long shadows across the frost-rimed gardens of Ashbourne. Eleanor Gray stood at the window of her small chamber in the east wing, watching as Thomas Hale and the Duke walked slowly along the gravel paths below. The 2 men made a striking contrast, Thomas robust and animated, gesturing broadly as he spoke, Edmund more contained, his posture still bearing the stiffness of his injury, yet moving with greater confidence than he had shown a fortnight ago. She observed them with a curious mixture of satisfaction and disquiet. The Duke's physical improvement was evident, gratifying her professional pride. Yet Thomas Hale's arrival had introduced an unexpected element into the carefully balanced routine she had established at Ashbourne. His easy familiarity with Edmund, his unabashed vitality, and his perceptive glances had discomposed her in ways she had not anticipated. A knock at her door interrupted these reflections. "Enter," she called, turning from the window. Lady Miriam Valahurst appeared, elegant in a morning dress of deep burgundy, her golden hair arranged in a simple but becoming style. "Good morning, Mrs. Gray. I trust you slept well?" "Quite well, thank you, my lady." Eleanor replied, curtsying slightly. Though Lady Miriam had always treated her with perfect courtesy, Eleanor remained acutely aware of the social gulf between them, a chasm that no amount of kindness could entirely bridge. "I wish to speak with you privately," Lady Miriam continued, closing the door behind her, "about my brother's progress." "Of course." Eleanor gestured toward the single armchair her quarters afforded, taking a seat on the edge of the bed herself. "His physical recovery advances steadily. The inflammation has reduced significantly, and his range of motion improves daily." Lady Miriam nodded, her blue eyes, so like her brother's, studying Eleanor with an intensity that suggested she sought information beyond the merely medical. "And his spirits?" she inquired. "I observe a marked difference since your arrival. Edmund has begun to engage with his surroundings again, to take interest in matters beyond his immediate discomfort." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "The presence of his friend appears to have had a most salutary effect. Mr. Hale brings reminders of a life beyond illness." "Indeed," Lady Miriam agreed. "Thomas has always possessed the gift of drawing Edmund out of himself. Yet the change began before his arrival, Mrs. Grey. It began with you." A faint warmth crept into Eleanor's cheeks. "You are too kind, my lady. I have merely provided basic care and companionship. We both know you have provided considerably more than that." Lady Miriam leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "You have given him something he had forgotten existed, compassion without pity, presence without demand." Eleanor looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. "I have simply treated him as I would wish to be treated in similar circumstances." "As one who has also known loss," Lady Miriam observed gently. "Yes?" Eleanor did not elaborate. Her grief was a private thing, carried close like a locket against her heart, not hidden precisely, but not displayed for casual inspection either. Lady Miriam seemed to respect this reticence. "I did not come merely to express gratitude, Mrs. Grey, though that is certainly due. I came to warn you." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Warn me, my lady." "About Sir Alaric Thornwell." Lady Miriam's expression hardened slightly. "I am aware that he has made inquiries regarding your past employment. Such investigations exceed his authority, and I have made my displeasure known to him directly." "That was most kind," Eleanor acknowledged. "Though perhaps unnecessary, I have nothing to conceal. Nothing, perhaps, but much that could be misrepresented by one skilled in the art of insinuation." Lady Miriam sighed. "Sir Alaric has managed Ashbourne's affairs competently since my brother's withdrawal from active oversight, but I have observed in him a tendency to extend his influence beyond its proper bounds. He views your presence here as a potential threat to that influence." Eleanor considered this assessment, recalling the calculated appraisal in the estate manager's cold green eyes whenever they encountered one another. "May I speak frankly, Lady Miriam?" "Please do." "I believe Sir Alaric's concern stems from more than mere professional territory. He seems possessive of his grace in a manner that suggests personal ambition rather than financial stewardship." Lady Miriam's eyebrows rose slightly. "You perceive much, Mrs. Grey." "Indeed, there have been occasions when I have wondered whether Sir Alaric views himself not merely as Edmund's employee, but as his potential successor in certain respects." The implication hung in the air between them, that Thornwell might harbour designs not merely on Ashbourne's management, but on its ownership through some advantageous arrangement. "I tell you this," Lady Miriam continued after a moment, "not to burden you with household intrigues, but to counsel caution. Your position here is unique. The care of a nobleman's person carries intimacies that can easily be misconstrued by those inclined toward malicious interpretation." "I understand," Eleanor replied quietly, "and I assure you, Lady Miriam, that I have always conducted myself with the utmost propriety." "I do not doubt it." Lady Miriam rose, smoothing her skirts with an elegant gesture. "But propriety is a shield, not a sword. It may protect against accusations, but it cannot always counter them effectively." As Lady Miriam departed, Eleanor returned to the window, her thoughts troubled. Below, Thomas and Edmund had been joined by Sir Alaric, whose tall figure seemed to cast a longer shadow than the morning sun warranted. The three men stood in conversation, the estate manager bowing deferentially as he presented what appeared to be documents for the Duke's consideration. Even from this distance, Eleanor could discern the subtle shift in Edmund's posture, a stiffening, a withdrawal into the formal reserve he had begun to shed during their evening readings. It pained her to see it, this retreat behind the armour of his rank and isolation. A movement caught her eye, Thomas placing a hand on Edmund's shoulder, his gesture one of easy camaraderie. The Duke's stance relaxed incrementally, and together the three men began to walk toward the house, Sir Alaric a half-step behind, his portfolio clutched tightly against his chest. Eleanor stepped back from the window, suddenly conscious of how her observation might appear to anyone glancing upward. A widow watching from above, her interest exceeding her station, it required little imagination to fashion such innocent surveillance into something more questionable. Crossing to the small writing desk tucked beneath the eaves, she withdrew her journal and opened it to the most recent entry. The pages contained not personal reflections, but clinical observations, notes on Edmund's physical progress, adjustments to his treatments, recommendations for future care. She had maintained such records throughout her career as a nurse, finding that the discipline of documentation helped clarify her thoughts and improve her practice. Yet, as she lifted her pen to make a new entry, she found herself hesitating. How to record the less tangible aspects of her patient's recovery, the gradual softening of his expression when she entered a room, the increasing frequency with which he initiated conversation rather than merely responding to it, the way his hand sometimes lingered near hers when she passed him a book or adjusted his pillows. These were not symptoms to be catalogued, but rather, what? Evidence of a man returning to life, perhaps, or merely the natural gratitude of a patient toward his caregiver, a sentiment that would fade as surely as the pain in his injured leg once her services were no longer required. And they would not be required much longer, Eleanor acknowledged to herself. The Duke's physical recovery progressed apace, and with Thomas Hale's arrival, his social isolation had begun to crumble as well. Soon there would be no medical justification for her continued presence at Ashbourne. The thought brought a sharp pang that she had not anticipated. She had entered this employment, as she had all others, with professional detachment and a clear understanding of its temporary nature. Yet somehow in the quiet evenings reading by lamplight, in the careful negotiations of Edmund's pride and pain during their exercises, in the gradual revealing of the man beneath the ducal title, she had allowed something personal to intrude upon her professional reserve. Not love, she would not name it thus. Rather, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps. Two souls marked by loss, yet still capable of perceiving beauty, still vulnerable to the quiet intimacy of shared silence. A dangerous recognition, she reminded herself firmly. For she was still a widow of modest means, dependent upon her reputation for her livelihood, while he remained a duke, bound by the expectations and obligations of his rank, regardless of his temporary withdrawal from society. Yet even as she cautioned herself thus, Eleanor could not help but recall the expression in Edmund's eyes the previous evening, when she had read from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. As she recited the lines about finding in nature the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart, and soul of all my moral being, he had looked up from his contemplation of the fire, his gaze meeting hers with a recognition so profound that it had momentarily stolen her breath. In that instant, the distance between nurse and patient, widow and nobleman, had seemed to collapse entirely, revealing only two people who understood the fragility of happiness and the endurance of sorrow. A second knock at her door, firmer this time, startled Eleanor from her reverie. "Come," she called, hastily closing her journal. The door opened to reveal not Lady Miriam, but Sir Alaric Thornwell himself, his tall figure seeming to fill the modest doorway. He did not enter, but remained on the threshold, regarding her with that measuring gaze she had come to distrust. "Mrs. Grey," he acknowledged, with a slight bow. "I hope I am not interrupting your reflections." "Not at all, Sir Alaric," she replied, rising from her desk. "How may I assist you?" "His Grace requests your presence in the library immediately." Thornwell's tone suggested that he found the summons as surprising as she did. "It appears there is some discussion regarding the estate's charitable obligations, to which he feels your perspective might be valuable." Eleanor concealed her surprise behind a composed expression. "I shall attend him directly. Thank you for conveying the message." Thornwell made no move to depart. Instead, he studied her with a calculated intensity that made her acutely conscious of the simplicity of her surroundings, the narrow bed, the worn carpet, the single chair that Lady Miriam had recently occupied. "You have made quite an impression upon the Valahurst household in a remarkably short time, Mrs. Grey," he observed. "One might almost say an unprecedented impression." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I have simply performed my duties to the best of my ability, Sir Alaric. Nothing more." "Indeed." His thin lips curved in what might generously be called a smile. "Then you must possess most exceptional abilities. The Duke has scarcely permitted a physician to examine him these past years, yet here you are, not merely attending to his physical needs, but now, it seems, being consulted on matters of estate management. The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt a flash of indignation that she quickly suppressed. To reveal emotion would be to grant him an advantage. "I believe His Grace values diverse perspectives on matters of community welfare," she replied evenly. "Having worked among those less fortunate, I may offer observations that complement your more financial expertise." A muscle twitched near Thornwell's jaw, a small tell that suggested her gentle riposte had found its mark. "How commendable," he said after a moment, "though one wonders whether such consultations might not exceed the bounds of your employment here. The Duke's health appears much improved of late. Perhaps your services will soon be required elsewhere." With that parting observation, he bowed slightly and withdrew, leaving Eleanor to contemplate the veiled threat contained within his ostensibly innocuous remark. That he wished her gone from Ashbourne was clear. What measures he might employ to hasten that departure remained to be seen. Squaring her shoulders, Eleanor checked her appearance in the small mirror above the washstand. Her grey dress was simple but neat, her cap freshly laundered, her hair secured in its customary style. Nothing in her aspect could invite criticism or suggest impropriety. Thus, armoured in respectability, she made her way toward the library, unaware that the conversation awaiting her there would alter the course of her carefully ordered life in ways she could not yet imagine. He raised the seal. The room fell quiet. The library of Ashbourne Hall had always been Edmund's sanctuary, a haven of leather-bound wisdom and the comforting scent of aged paper. Now, as he stood before the great oak desk, the space felt charged with an unfamiliar energy. Thomas lounged in a wingback chair by the fire, outwardly relaxed but watching the proceedings with keen interest. Sir Alaric stood rigidly near the door, his posture suggesting both deference and disapproval. Lady Miriam occupied a seat near the window, her needlework momentarily forgotten in her lap, and Eleanor, Mrs. Grey, he corrected himself mentally, stood before him, her hands clasped at her waist, her expression composed yet alert. The morning light from the tall windows caught the silver threads in her brown hair, creating a subtle halo effect that Edmund found himself unable to look away from. "Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Grey," he began, his voice more formal than he had intended. "I have been discussing with Mr. Hale and my sister certain matters regarding Ashbourne's charitable obligations to the surrounding community." Eleanor nodded, her grey eyes meeting his directly. "I am honoured to be included in such discussions, Your Grace, though I confess I am uncertain how I might contribute." "Perhaps I might clarify," Thomas interjected, rising from his chair with characteristic energy. "I have been arguing that Ashbourne's tenant farmers would benefit greatly from the establishment of a small infirmary, nothing elaborate, but a place where basic medical care might be provided without the necessity of travelling to the town physician." "A commendable idea," Eleanor acknowledged, "though the expense of maintaining such a facility would be considerable," Sir Alaric interrupted smoothly, "as I have been at pains to explain to Mr. Hale. The estate's finances, while stable, do not permit such extravagant gestures of benevolence." Edmund observed the flicker of irritation that crossed Eleanor's face before her features settled once more into polite attention. There was something in her restraint that moved him, the dignity with which she navigated a conversation where others presumed to speak for those of her station. "I believe," Edmund said, placing subtle emphasis on the pronoun, "that Mrs. Grey's experience both as a nurse and as someone who has worked among those of modest means might offer insights that none of us can provide from our more privileged perspectives." He was rewarded by the brief widening of Eleanor's eyes, surprise at being truly consulted rather than merely humoured. The moment passed quickly, but it left a curious warmth in Edmund's chest. "In my experience," she began carefully, "the greatest obstacle to proper care among the working classes is not merely the distance to a physician, but the loss of wages during illness. An infirmary, while valuable, addresses only half the problem." Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "Precisely the point I was attempting to make. What good is treatment if the fear of destitution prevents its being sought?" "Exactly," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining confidence. "If I may be so bold, I would suggest that any medical facility be accompanied by a modest fund to supplement lost wages during recovery, particularly for those with dependents." Sir Alaric's lips thinned visibly. "Such a policy would invite abuse. Every minor ailment would become an opportunity to claim support." "Not if properly administered," Eleanor countered. a spark of passion animating her typically reserved demeanor. I have observed similar arrangements function effectively under the oversight of parish committees. Local knowledge prevents exploitation, while compassion prevents unnecessary suffering. Edmund found himself staring at her with undisguised admiration. Gone was the quiet nurse who moved unobtrusively through his chambers. In her place stood a woman of conviction and intelligence, articulating principles of practical charity that resonated deeply with beliefs he had once championed himself. "Mrs. Gray makes an excellent point," Lady Miriam remarked, setting aside her needlework entirely. "Indeed, the vestry committee has considered similar measures in the past. Perhaps a joint endeavour between the estate and the parish would distribute both the cost and the responsibility more equitably." Thomas clapped his hands together. "Capital suggestion. Shared administration would also discourage any perception of—" "How did you phrase it, Thornwell? Extravagant benevolence. Rather, it becomes community stewardship." Sir Alaric's expression remained impassive, but Edmund detected the subtle tightening of his jaw that signalled contained displeasure. "As always, I defer to His Grace's judgment in these matters. I merely caution that compassion, while admirable, must be balanced against fiscal responsibility." "A balance I believe we are capable of striking," Edmund replied, a note of finality in his tone. "Lady Miriam, would you be willing to consult with the vicar regarding potential cooperation between estate and parish?" "Most gladly," his sister agreed, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm Edmund had not seen in years. "And Mrs. Gray," he continued, turning toward Eleanor once more, "would you consider drafting recommendations for the practical aspects of such an infirmary? Your experience would be invaluable in determining necessary supplies, staffing, and procedures." Eleanor curtsied, a faint flush colouring her cheeks. "I would be honoured, Your Grace." "Excellent." Edmund moved behind the desk, conscious of a vigour in his movements that had been absent for too long. "Sir Alaric, please prepare an accounting of what funds might reasonably be allocated to this project without compromising the estate's obligations." The estate manager bowed stiffly. "As you wish, Your Grace. Though I must note that such a significant undertaking would typically require more extensive consultation and planning. Perhaps a delay of several months would be prudent, allowing for proper financial forecasting." "I see no reason for undue delay," Edmund countered, surprising himself with the firmness of his tone. "Winter approaches, bringing with it the usual increase in illness among those whose housing and nourishment are less certain than our own. I would have this infirmary established before the worst of the season is upon us." Thomas made no attempt to conceal his approval, while Lady Miriam regarded her brother with an expression that mingled pride with something like vindication. Only Sir Alaric remained stone-faced, his acquiescence indicated solely by a curt nod. "If that will be all, Your Grace?" the manager inquired. "For the present," Edmund confirmed, "though I would like to review the tenant ledgers this afternoon. It has been too long since I examined them personally." A flicker of something, alarm, annoyance, crossed Thornwell's features before he mastered himself once more. "Of course, I shall have them prepared for your inspection by 2 o'clock. As Sir Alaric withdrew, Edmund became aware of the subtle shift in the library's atmosphere, as though a chill draught had departed, leaving only the comfortable warmth of the fire and the companionship of those who remained. "Well," Thomas exclaimed, breaking the momentary silence, "I must say, Edmund, this is precisely the sort of decisive leadership I've been hoping to witness. One might almost believe the Ghost Duke has finally decided to rejoin the land of the living." "Thomas," Lady Miriam chided gently, though her expression suggested agreement with the sentiment, if not the phrasing. Edmund found his attention drawn to Eleanor, who had moved slightly apart from the group, her gaze directed toward the library windows. The morning light illuminated her profile, revealing a pensive expression that stirred his curiosity. "Mrs. Gray," he said, approaching her with deliberate casualness, "you seem troubled. Have I imposed an unwelcome burden with this request?" She turned to face him, her grey eyes meeting his with that direct gaze he had come to value for its honesty. "Not at all, Your Grace. I am merely surprised by the swiftness of the decision. Does it seem impulsive to you?" A small smile touched her lips. "Perhaps, though not in an unfavourable sense. Sometimes swiftness in good works is a virtue rather than a liability." "My thoughts exactly," Thomas interjected, joining them by the window. "Strike while the iron of compassion is hot, I always say, or at least I say it now, having just invented the phrase." Eleanor's smile widened at this, and Edmund felt a curious satisfaction at having facilitated this moment of genuine amusement. How long had it been, he wondered, since laughter had echoed within these walls, since decisions had been made not from obligation, but from conviction? "If I may inquire," Eleanor ventured after a moment, "what prompted this particular initiative at this particular time?" The question was innocuous enough, yet Edmund sensed layers beneath it, an invitation to reveal more of himself than he had perhaps intended. Before he could formulate a response that would neither conceal nor expose too much, Thomas answered for him. "Why, you did, Mrs. Gray," his friend declared with characteristic bluntness. "Or rather, your influence upon our reclusive Duke. Since your arrival, he has begun to look outward rather than inward, a transformation for which we are all profoundly grateful." Edmund observed the heightened color in Eleanor's cheeks and felt a corresponding warmth in his own. "Thomas exaggerates, as is his custom," he said quickly. "The idea of an infirmary has been discussed before. It merely required the right moment for implementation, and the right catalyst," Lady Miriam added softly, joining their circle by the window. "Do not underestimate your contribution, Mrs. Gray. My brother's renewed interest in his responsibilities is no small achievement." Eleanor's discomfort was evident, though she masked it well behind a composed expression. "I believe His Grace's recovery would have progressed regardless of my particular presence. The human spirit tends naturally toward healing when circumstances permit." "How diplomatic," Thomas remarked, his eyes twinkling. "Though I suspect you underestimate your own influence, Mrs. Gray. Some individuals possess a natural gift for drawing others out of themselves, for reminding them of connections they had forgotten existed." The conversation was veering toward territory Edmund found increasingly uncomfortable, not because it was untrue, but because it approached truths he was not yet prepared to acknowledge openly. He cleared his throat, drawing attention back to more practical matters. "The infirmary," he stated firmly. "I believe we were discussing its particulars, not my spiritual rehabilitation." Lady Miriam exchanged a knowing glance with Thomas, but graciously followed her brother's lead. "Indeed. I shall speak with Reverend Pembroke this very afternoon. His experience with the Parish Relief Committee will be invaluable. And I," Thomas added, "shall write to my estate manager in Northumberland for particulars of the medical facility we established there last year. No need to reinvent the wheel entirely." As the conversation turned to logistics and planning, Edmund found his attention repeatedly drawn to Eleanor, who participated with quiet authority, offering practical suggestions informed by her experience. The animation in her face as she discussed matters close to her heart transformed her from merely pleasant to genuinely beautiful, not in the conventional sense that had once governed his appreciation of feminine charm, but in a deeper, more essential manner. It struck him suddenly that he knew very little of her life before she had come to Ashbourne. What circumstances had shaped this woman of such quiet strength and dignity? What joys and sorrows had marked her path before it intersected with his own? The questions lingered in his mind as the morning progressed, eventually leading the small group from the library to the estate office, where maps and surveys were consulted regarding potential locations for the infirmary. Throughout these deliberations, Edmund observed Sir Alaric's increasing tension, manifested in tight smiles and clipped responses whenever Eleanor's suggestions were met with approval. By midday, the broad outlines of the plan had been established, with responsibilities distributed among them. As they prepared to adjourn for luncheon, Sir Alaric approached Edmund with a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. "For your grace," he began, his tone carefully modulated, "a matter has arisen that requires your immediate attention. Perhaps we might discuss it privately." Edmund noted the quick glance Thornwell directed toward Eleanor, who was engaged in conversation with Lady Miriam across the room. "Is it urgent, Sir Alaric? We were about to break for the midday meal. I believe you will find it both urgent and delicate," Thornwell replied, lowering his voice. "It concerns certain inquiries I have made regarding Mrs. Gray's background." A cold anger stirred in Edmund's chest. "I believe I made my feelings on that subject quite clear." "Indeed, Your Grace. However, new information has come to light that I would be remiss in withholding, particularly given the increasing influence Mrs. Gray appears to wield within the household." Before Edmund could respond, Thomas joined them, clapping a hand on his shoulder with characteristic informality. "What's this, Thornwell? More financial objections to our infirmary plans? Surely we've addressed your concerns thoroughly." Sir Alaric's expression tightened momentarily before smoothing once more into professional neutrality. "Not at all, Mr. Hale. I was merely requesting a private audience with His Grace regarding an unrelated administrative matter. After luncheon, Sir Alaric, Edmund decided firmly. I believe we've earned a respite from administrative concerns, however pressing they may seem. As they made their way to the dining room, Edmund found himself troubled by the encounter. What new information could Thornwell possibly have uncovered, and to what purpose was he pursuing this investigation with such determination? The questions lingered uneasily in his mind as he took his place at the head of the table, a position he had avoided since Catherine's death, preferring to take his meals in solitude. Today, however, the presence of Thomas, Miriam, and most particularly Eleanor made the dining room seem less a monument to absence and more a space of potential conviviality. As the meal progressed, Edmund observed the easy rapport that had developed between Thomas and Eleanor. His friend's natural charm and genuine interest in others had always made him an engaging companion, but there was something in the way Eleanor responded, a quiet animation, a measured openness, that stirred an unexpected emotion in Edmund's breast. Not jealousy, he assured himself, merely concern that Thomas, with his expansive personality, might overwhelm Eleanor's more reserved nature. Yet she seemed to be holding her own admirably, matching his friend's anecdotes with thoughtful observations that revealed both intelligence and gentle humor. Mrs. Gray, Thomas was saying, you mentioned having worked in a military hospital during the Crimean conflict. Did you perhaps encounter Miss Nightingale or her associates? Eleanor shook her head, a shadow passing briefly across her features. No, Mr. Hale. I was stationed at a smaller facility near Portsmouth, tending to those who had been transported home. My late husband was serving as a surgeon's assistant at the front. Ah, I see. Thomas's expression softened with genuine sympathy. The war claimed many good men. I lost a cousin at Balaclava, Arthur Hale. Perhaps your husband knew of him. A curious stillness came over Eleanor's face. Arthur Hale, she repeated softly. Yes, I believe my husband mentioned him in his letters. A cavalry officer, was he not? Indeed, Thomas exclaimed. How extraordinary! To think that our paths might have crossed, however indirectly, years before this meeting. Edmund watched this exchange with growing unease, though he could not have articulated precisely why. There was something in Eleanor's expression, a guardedness behind her polite interest, that suggested the connection troubled rather than pleased her. Before he could reflect further on this impression, Sir Alaric entered the dining room, a sealed document in his hand. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but an urgent communication has arrived from London. The messenger awaits your reply. Edmund accepted the letter with a frown. The seal bore the crest of his solicitor, Mr. Hargrove, a man who corresponded rarely and only on matters of significant legal importance. Breaking the seal, he scanned the contents quickly, his expression growing increasingly grave. Is something amiss, Edmund? Miriam inquired, setting down her fork with concern. It appears, he replied slowly, that questions have been raised regarding certain estate transactions conducted during my period of withdrawal from active management. Mr. Hargrove requests my immediate attention to the matter. Sir Alaric's face remained impassive, but Edmund noted a slight tensing of his shoulders. Nothing serious, I trust, Your Grace. Merely routine inquiries, perhaps. Perhaps, Edmund agreed, though the solicitor's tone suggested otherwise. In any case, it requires review. Sir Alaric, please have the relevant documents prepared in the estate office. I shall attend to them directly after luncheon. Of course, Your Grace. The manager bowed and withdrew, his departure followed by a moment of uncomfortable silence. Thomas cleared his throat. Well, the timing is fortuitous at least. Better to address such matters now, when you're feeling more yourself, than to have them linger unattended. Indeed, Edmund agreed, though his appetite had vanished. He found his gaze drawn to Eleanor, who was regarding him with quiet concern. Mrs. Gray, I fear our discussion of the infirmary plans may need to be postponed temporarily. Of course, Your Grace, she replied immediately. Estate matters must take precedence. As the meal concluded and the company dispersed, Edmund made his way toward the estate office, his mind troubled by the convergence of unsettling elements, Thornwell's persistent investigations, the solicitor's unexpected communication, and that strange moment of hesitation when Eleanor had recognized Arthur Hale's name. Perhaps these were unrelated coincidences, he told himself. Yet as he approached the office where Sir Alaric awaited him with the estate ledgers, a deep unease settled in his chest, a premonition that the carefully ordered world he had begun to rebuild around Eleanor's steadying presence was about to face a challenge he had not anticipated. The door opened, not to her, The estate office at Ashbourne Hall had always been a place of order and precision. Ledgers bound in green leather lined the shelves, each containing the meticulous record of generations of stewardship. Today, however, as Edmund stood behind the massive oak desk, those orderly columns of figures seemed to swim before his eyes, revealing patterns that chilled him to the marrow. "For you will observe, Your Grace," Sir Alaric was saying, his voice maintaining its customary smooth deference, "that all transactions were properly recorded and countersigned according to the protocols established during your indisposition." Edmund looked up from the ledger, fixing the estate manager with a steady gaze. "Indeed, and yet Mr. Hargrove's letter suggests irregularities in the timber contracts specifically, particularly those negotiated with Blackwood Enterprises." A flicker of something, annoyance, anxiety, crossed Thornwell's face before his features settled once more into professional composure. "A misunderstanding, surely. Lord Blackwood's business interests are extensive and occasionally complex, but I assure you every agreement was advantageous to Ashbourne." "Advantageous," Edmund repeated, turning to a marked page. "Yet these figures indicate we received considerably less than market value for the eastern woodlands." Sir Alaric smoothed his waistcoat, a gesture Edmund had come to recognize as a sign of concealed discomfort. "Market fluctuations, Your Grace. The timber trade experienced unexpected volatility that season." "How curious," came Thomas's voice from the doorway, "that such volatility affected only Ashbourne's transactions, while neighbouring estates managed to secure considerably more favourable terms." Edmund glanced up to see his friend lounging against the doorframe, his casual posture belying the sharpness in his gaze. Thomas had always possessed a talent for appearing indolent while missing nothing of consequence. "Mr. Hale," Thornwell acknowledged stiffly, "this is a private discussion regarding estate matters." "Is it indeed?" Thomas strolled into the room, examining a ledger with exaggerated interest. "As Edmund's oldest friend and a fellow landowner, I believe I might offer some useful perspective. For instance, did you know that Lord Blackwood recently acquired a hunting lodge in Northumberland? A magnificent property by all accounts, quite beyond the means of most gentlemen of his rank." Sir Alaric's expression hardened. "I fail to see the relevance." "No?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps this might clarify matters." He withdrew a folded document from his coat pocket, placing it deliberately on the desk before Edmund. "A copy of the deed to said lodge. Note particularly the date of acquisition and the amount paid." Edmund scanned the document, his jaw tightening as the implications became clear. 3 days after the timber contract was finalized, and for a sum nearly identical to the discrepancy between market value and what Ashbourne received. "A coincidence, surely," Thomas remarked, his tone making it clear he believed nothing of the sort. Sir Alaric's face had grown pale, though his voice remained controlled. "This is outrageous speculation. I have served the Valahurst family with absolute loyalty for nearly a decade, and been handsomely compensated for that service," Edmund observed coldly, though perhaps not handsomely enough, it seems. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, grey clouds had gathered, casting the office into deepening shadow despite the early afternoon hour. "If you doubt my integrity, Your Grace," Thornwell said at last, drawing himself up, "perhaps it would be best if I tendered my resignation." "An excellent suggestion," Thomas interjected before Edmund could respond, "though I dare say Mr. Hargrove might have more to say on the matter than merely accepting your withdrawal." The threat of legal consequences hung in the air, unmistakable though unspoken. Sir Alaric's expression shifted from indignation to calculation, his gaze moving between the two men as he assessed his position. "Before we proceed further," Edmund said, his voice quiet but firm, "I would hear your explanation, Sir Alaric. Not justification, but truth. I have been negligent in my duties, I acknowledge that freely, but I did not expect that negligence to be exploited by one I trusted." Something like shame flickered briefly across the manager's features. "Your Grace, the situation is not as it appears. There were considerations beyond mere profit, arrangements that benefited Ashbourne in ways not reflected in these figures." "What arrangements?" Edmund demanded. Thornwell hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "Lord Blackwood possesses certain influence in circles that matter, connections that have shielded Ashbourne from unwelcome scrutiny during your withdrawal from society." "Scrutiny regarding what, precisely?" The door opened again before Thornwell could answer. Lady Miriam entered, followed by Eleanor, both women pausing on the threshold as they registered the tension in the room. "Forgive the interruption," Miriam began, "but Actually, your timing is most fortunate, Thomas interrupted, his expression brightening. Mrs. Gray, I believe you might offer valuable perspective on the matter at hand. Edmund watched as Eleanor's gaze moved between the ledgers on the desk and Sir Alaric's increasingly rigid posture. Her grey eyes, usually so calm, now held a wariness that suggested she sensed the undercurrents of the situation. I cannot imagine how I might contribute to estate business, she replied carefully. Not estate business precisely, Thomas clarified. Rather, a curious connection that has emerged. You mentioned having encountered the name of my cousin, Arthur Hale, during your husband's service in the Crimea. I wonder, did you perhaps also encounter Lord Blackwood's son, Lieutenant James Blackwood? He served in the same regiment. Edmund observed the sudden stillness that came over Eleanor. Not merely surprise, but something deeper, more visceral. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the fabric of her grey dress. Yes, she admitted after a moment. I knew Lieutenant Blackwood. He was acquainted with my husband. How interesting, Thomas mused, his tone deceptively casual. And would this acquaintance have continued after your husband's passing? Perhaps during your brief employment in Lord Blackwood's household? Sir Alaric's head snapped up, his gaze sharpening as it fixed on Eleanor. You were employed by Lord Blackwood? This was not mentioned in your references. It was a brief engagement, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the heightened colour in her cheeks. As I explained to His Grace previously, I left the position when asked to administer treatments I considered improper. Indeed? Sir Alaric's tone suggested dawning comprehension, as though pieces of a puzzle were suddenly aligning. And did your departure have anything to do with certain accusations regarding estate funds? Funds that mysteriously disappeared during your tenure in the household? The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Edmund felt his chest tighten with a cold fury he had not experienced in years. You go too far, Thornwell, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. But Eleanor raised a hand, her expression composed, despite the tremor Edmund detected in the gesture. No, Your Grace. Let him speak. I would hear these accusations directly, rather than have them whispered behind closed doors. Sir Alaric straightened, sensing an advantage. It is a matter of public record, though carefully suppressed, that certain valuable items disappeared from Lord Blackwood's London residence during Mrs. Gray's employment there. Silver, jewellery, items easily concealed and transported. No charges were brought due to, shall we say, a gentleman's consideration for a widow's reputation. But the circumstances of her departure were at best suspicious. How fascinating, Thomas remarked, his expression hardening. And when did you come by this information, Sir Alaric? Recently, perhaps? Through correspondence with Lord Blackwood himself? The estate manager's hesitation was answer enough. Edmund felt the pieces sliding into place with sickening clarity, the timber contracts, the hunting lodge, the sudden investigation into Eleanor's past. Not random events, but a calculated strategy. I believe I understand now, he said, his gaze moving between Thornwell and Eleanor. When Mrs. Gray arrived at Ashbourne, you perceived a threat to your arrangement with Lord Blackwood. Her previous connection to the family raised concerns that she might recognize discrepancies in the estate's dealings. So you sought ammunition against her credibility, should the need arise. Her prudent precaution merely, Sir Alaric replied, regaining some of his composure. The estate's reputation was being systematically exploited by you and your confederate, Edmund interrupted coldly. Do not insult my intelligence further, Sir Alaric. The question that remains is how deeply this corruption extends. What other arrangements have you made in my name? The silence that followed was broken by Eleanor's voice, quiet but clear. If I may speak, Your Grace. Edmund turned toward her, struck by the calm dignity in her bearing, despite the accusations that had been levelled against her. Please do, Mrs. Gray. The items that disappeared from Lord Blackwood's London residence were not stolen, but reclaimed, she said simply. They belong to my husband's family, heirlooms entrusted to Lieutenant Blackwood for safekeeping during the war. After my husband's death, the lieutenant claimed they had been lost. I later discovered them in Lord Blackwood's possession. So you took them back, Thomas surmised, his expression softening with understanding. I took what was rightfully mine, Eleanor corrected gently. A silver locket containing my son's portrait, a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to my husband's mother, and a small gold pocket watch, his father's. Hardly the fortune Sir Alaric implies, but of immeasurable value to me. Edmund felt something twist in his chest at the quiet dignity with which she related this history. No histrionics, no tearful protestations of innocence, simply the truth offered plainly. to be accepted or rejected on its merits. "Why did you not pursue legal redress?" he asked, genuinely curious. A small, sad smile touched her lips. What court would believe a widow's claim against that of a lord's son, particularly when that son had returned a hero, while my husband— She hesitated, a shadow passing across her features. "While my husband had died under circumstances that some considered questionable." "Questionable?" Thomas prompted gently. Eleanor's gaze dropped to her hands, now folded tightly before her. "The official report stated he died of wounds received in battle, but his last letter to me suggested he had discovered improprieties in the regimental accounts, supplies sold for private profit, medicines diluted or replaced with inferior substitutes. He intended to report his findings to the commanding officer." "Arthur," Thomas said softly. "My cousin was that commanding officer." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, Captain Hale was known for his integrity. My husband trusted him implicitly, but before they could meet, both men were killed in what was described as an enemy attack on the medical tent. The implications hung heavily in the air." Edmund looked to Sir Alaric, whose expression had shifted from calculated confidence to growing alarm as the conversation veered into territory he clearly had not anticipated. "Lord Blackwood's son," Edmund said slowly, "was involved in these improprieties. He was the quartermaster," Eleanor confirmed quietly, "responsible for supplies and their distribution." Thomas's face had darkened with grief and anger. "So, Arthur was silenced, along with your husband. And when you later discovered family heirlooms in Blackwood's possession—" "I took them back," Eleanor finished simply, "and left his household the same night. After which," Edmund continued, the pieces of this sordid puzzle now falling rapidly into place, "Lord Blackwood sought to discredit you should you ever speak out. And more recently, upon learning of your position here, he alerted his business associate," he gestured toward the now visibly uncomfortable Sir Alaric, "to your presence, fearing you might recognize his son's name in the estate records and draw unwelcome connections." The storm that had been gathering outside now broke, rain lashing against the windows as though nature itself were expressing the turbulence within the room. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene. Eleanor standing straight and dignified despite her evident distress, Lady Miriam beside her in silent support, Thomas rigid with newfound understanding, and Sir Alaric, whose facade of polished competence had crumbled entirely. "Your Grace," the estate manager began, his tone now almost pleading, "you must understand the delicacy of my position. Lord Blackwood's influence extends to the highest circles. When he approached me regarding the timber contracts, the implications of refusal were substantial. So you betrayed my trust instead," Edmund concluded, his voice cold, "exploited my grief and withdrawal to line your pockets and those of your co-conspirator, and then sought to discredit an innocent woman whose only crime was reclaiming what was rightfully hers." Sir Alaric's shoulders slumped in defeat. "The arrangement was mutually beneficial." "Not to Ashbourne," Thomas observed dryly, "nor to its tenants who have suffered from reduced investments, while estate profits were diverted elsewhere." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Edmund looked to Eleanor, struck by the composure she maintained, despite having her painful past exposed so unexpectedly. "Mrs. Grey," he said softly, "I owe you an apology. You came to Ashbourne offering healing and compassion, only to be subjected to suspicion and investigation." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace," she replied, her grey eyes meeting his directly. "You were not the author of these circumstances." "No, but I was the enabler through my neglect." Edmund turned back to Sir Alaric, his decision crystallizing. "You will prepare a complete accounting of all transactions conducted with Lord Blackwood or his interests. You will then tender your resignation, effective immediately. Whether legal charges follow will depend upon the extent of the malfeasance revealed." The estate manager opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again, recognizing the futility of further argument. With a stiff bow he withdrew, the door closing behind him with an air of finality. As the tension in the room eased slightly, Lady Miriam approached her brother, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You handled that admirably, Edmund, though I fear this may be only the beginning of a painful reckoning." "Better painful truth than comfortable deception," he replied, finding he meant it sincerely. How strange, he reflected, that after years of hiding from reality in the cocoon of his grief, he now found himself preferring harsh truths to soothing falsehoods. His gaze returned to Eleanor, who stood somewhat apart, her expression thoughtful. What must she think of him now? a nobleman so absorbed in his own suffering that he had allowed corruption to flourish under his very roof, indirectly causing her further pain. Yet when she looked up and their eyes met across the room, he saw not condemnation but understanding, that same recognition of kindred experience that had drawn him to her from the first. They had both been wounded by circumstance, both sought refuge in isolation, and both were now perhaps finding their way back to engagement with life's complexities. In that shared glance, brief though it was, Edmund felt something settle within him, a resolution, a commitment to action rather than withdrawal. And with it came the unsettling realization that Eleanor Gray had become not merely his nurse or his reader, or even his friend, but something far more essential, the voice that had called him back to himself. The door opened, not to her. 3 weeks passed, during which Ashbourne Hall underwent a transformation more profound than mere physical renovation. The heavy drapes that had shrouded windows were drawn back, allowing light to flood rooms long consigned to shadow. Fires blazed in grates that had stood cold for seasons, their warmth a declaration against the deepening winter outside. And through the corridors moved the Duke of Ashbourne himself, no longer the spectral figure of local legend, but a man reclaiming his place in the world with deliberate purpose. The revelation of Sir Alaric's duplicity had precipitated changes beyond the immediate dismissal of the manager. A thorough audit of the estate's affairs, conducted under Thomas Hale's watchful eye, had uncovered a web of questionable transactions extending back nearly 3 years. Lord Blackwood's name appeared with disturbing frequency, each instance representing resources diverted from Ashbourne's coffers to private interests. "The scope is both better and worse than we initially feared," Thomas reported one evening as he, Edmund and Lady Miriam sat in the drawing-room, reviewing the latest findings. "Better in that the estate remains fundamentally sound. The damage, while substantial, has not compromised Ashbourne's long-term viability. Worse in that the corruption appears systematic rather than opportunistic." Edmund nodded, his expression grave yet resolute. "And the legal implications?" "Mr. Hargrove believes we have sufficient evidence to pursue redress," Miriam interjected, setting aside the letter from the solicitor she had been reading. "Though he cautions that Lord Blackwood's influence may complicate matters, the courts are not immune to pressure from those in high places." "Let them apply whatever pressure they wish," Edmund replied firmly. "I will not allow such exploitation to go unchallenged, regardless of the perpetrator's standing." Thomas smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. "Well said. The Edmund Valorhurst I remember is very much present in that declaration." The door opened to admit Eleanor, a tea tray balanced expertly in her hands. Though her official duties as nurse had largely concluded with Edmund's physical recovery, she had remained at Ashbourne by mutual agreement, ostensibly to oversee the planning of the infirmary, but in truth because neither she nor Edmund seemed inclined to sever the connection that had formed between them. "Mrs. Gray," Lady Miriam greeted her warmly, "you are a welcome sight. These legal discussions grow tedious without refreshment." Eleanor set down the tray, the familiar domestic ritual somehow transformed by her presence into something more meaningful, a symbol of normalcy restored, of care freely given and gratefully received. "Has there been progress?" she inquired, pouring tea with practiced grace. "Of a sort," Thomas replied, accepting a cup with a nod of thanks, though each answer seems to generate 3 new questions. "The latest puzzle concerns a series of payments made to a Mrs. E. Winters in Portsmouth, small sums, regularly dispersed, with no clear purpose indicated." Eleanor's hand paused briefly in the act of passing a cup to Edmund, a momentary hesitation that would have gone unnoticed by most observers. But Edmund, who had grown attuned to her every gesture during their weeks of close association, caught the slight tremor that followed. "For you recognize the name," he said, not a question but a gentle observation. She met his gaze, her grey eyes holding a shadow of old pain. "Yes. Elizabeth Winters was the wife of my husband's closest friend, another surgeon's assistant who died in the Crimea. She lives in Portsmouth still, I believe, with her young son." Thomas leaned forward, his expression alert. "And would there be any legitimate reason for Ashbourne to be providing her with funds?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "None that I can imagine. Unless—" She hesitated, a furrow appearing between her brows as she considered. "Unless," Edmund prompted gently. "Unless it represents some form of compensation," she said at last. "Or perhaps silence money. Edward, Mrs. Winters' husband, was with mine the night he discovered the discrepancies in the medical supplies. According to the official report, Edward survived the initial attack, but died of his wounds 2 days later. If he shared what he knew before dying, then his widow might possess information damaging to those involved in the scheme, Thomas concluded grimly, including our former estate manager and his noble confederate. Lady Miriam set down her cup with a decisive gesture. We must contact this Mrs. Winters immediately. Her testimony could prove invaluable in building our case against Lord Blackwood. Edmund studied Eleanor's face, noting the complex emotions that played across her features at this suggestion. You have reservations, he observed. She sighed softly. Elizabeth has suffered greatly. Her son never knew his father. To involve her in what will undoubtedly become a public scandal would likely mean subjecting her to unwelcome scrutiny, Edmund finished, understanding immediately. Yet if she is already receiving payments from those implicated, she is involved whether she chooses to be or not. Better to approach her openly and with honesty, Thomas added, than to leave her vulnerable to whatever pressure Blackwood might apply when he realizes his arrangement with Thornwell has been exposed. Eleanor nodded slowly. You are right, of course, and Elizabeth has always possessed a strong sense of justice. If approached properly, I believe she would want to contribute to setting matters right. Would you be willing to make that approach? Edmund asked, suddenly aware of how much he had come to value not only Eleanor's practical assistance, but her moral judgment. As a friend rather than a legal emissary, she met his gaze directly, that quiet strength he had come to admire evident in her steady regard. I would, Your Grace, though I would need to journey to Portsmouth to do so effectively. Such matters are best discussed in person rather than through correspondence. Of course, Edmund agreed, ignoring the sudden tightness in his chest at the prospect of her departure, however temporary. Thomas can accompany you to ensure your safety and provide any necessary legal context. Actually, Thomas interjected, a speculative gleam in his eye, I believe my presence might be more valuable here, continuing the audit and coordinating with Mr. Hargrove. Perhaps Lady Miriam would be a more suitable companion for Mrs. Grey. A gentlewoman's presence would lend propriety to the visit while still allowing for the intimate conversation needed. Miriam nodded, clearly approving of this suggestion. I would be most willing, and I confess I am curious to meet this Mrs. Winters, whose circumstances have become so unexpectedly entwined with our own. The matter thus settled, the conversation turned to practical arrangements for the journey, which would commence the following morning. Edmund participated in these discussions with appropriate attention, offering the use of his best carriage and most reliable driver, ensuring that funds would be available for whatever contingencies might arise. Yet beneath this practical exterior, he found himself grappling with a realization both profound and unsettling. The prospect of Eleanor's absence, even for a few days, filled him with a sense of loss he had not anticipated. When had her presence become so essential to his well-being? Not merely as a nurse attending his physical recovery, nor even as a companion alleviating his isolation, but as something far more fundamental, a kind of emotional touchstone, her quiet strength and integrity offering a standard against which he measured his own renewed engagement with life. As the evening progressed, Edmund found opportunities to observe her unobtrusively, the graceful efficiency with which she poured tea, the attentive tilt of her head as she listened to Thomas's anecdotes, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally illuminated her features when something genuinely amused her. None of these gestures was remarkable in itself, yet collectively they constituted a presence whose absence he now dreaded with an intensity that surprised him. Later, after Thomas had retired and Miriam had withdrawn to make preparations for the journey, Edmund found himself alone with Eleanor in the drawing-room. The fire had burned low, casting the space in a warm, intimate glow that seemed to blur the lines of propriety that typically governed their interactions. You have been quiet this evening, Your Grace, she observed, her voice gentle in the hushed room. Have I? He responded, moving to stand beside the fireplace. I suppose I have been preoccupied with thoughts of this business with Blackwood and its implications. A natural concern, she agreed, though her perceptive gaze suggested she sensed there was more to his reticence than mere legal worries. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken considerations. Edmund studied the dying embers, searching for words adequate to express the turmoil of his thoughts. I find myself, he began at last, troubled by the realization that I have come to rely upon your presence here at Ashbourne in ways I had not anticipated. Eleanor's hands stilled in the act of arranging her sewing basket. I have been honored to be of service during your convalescence, Your Grace. It is not your service I shall miss, he clarified softly, though that has indeed been invaluable. It is your companionship, your perspective, the particular quality of attention you bring to each moment. He turned to face her directly, struck anew by the quiet dignity of her bearing, even in this moment of unexpected vulnerability. I have grown accustomed to sharing my thoughts with you, Mrs. Gray, to hearing your voice in these rooms. The prospect of your absence, however brief, has made me aware of how essential that presence has become to my well-being. Colour rose in her cheeks, though her gaze remained steady. You honour me with such sentiments, Your Grace, yet I am conscious that my position here was always intended to be temporary. The circumstances that brought me to Ashbourne, your injury, your need for care, have largely resolved themselves. The circumstances, yes, Edmund acknowledged, but the connection that has formed between us, that seems to me to transcend its origins. He took a step toward her, his movement deliberate yet hesitant, like a man approaching some precious and fragile thing. I find myself wondering, Mrs. Gray, Eleanor, if you might consider remaining at Ashbourne in a more permanent capacity. The words hung in the air between them, their implications rippling outward like stones cast into still water. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, a complex emotion flickering across her features too quickly for him to interpret with certainty. In what capacity would you envision my remaining, Your Grace? She asked, her voice carefully controlled. Edmund hesitated, suddenly aware of the precipice before him. To speak plainly of his growing feelings would be to violate the careful boundaries that had governed their relationship thus far. Yet to retreat into ambiguity seemed a kind of cowardice he was no longer willing to embrace. In whatever capacity would allow us to continue this conversation, he said at last. This exchange of minds and perspectives that has become so valuable to me. I have no wish to presume upon your circumstances or to suggest arrangements that might compromise your independence. I merely wish to express that your departure, when it comes, will leave a void in these halls that I am not eager to confront. Eleanor's expression softened, though a shadow of caution remained in her gaze. Your Grace, Edmund, he interrupted gently. Here now, with no others present to remind us of our respective stations, could you not call me by my name? A small smile touched her lips, transforming her features with a warmth that reached her eyes. Edmund, she amended, I am deeply moved by your words. The weeks I have spent at Ashbourne have been healing for me as well. To find purpose again, to engage with minds that value substance over appearance, to witness your return to active life, these have been privileges I had not expected to encounter. She paused, her gaze dropping briefly to her hands before returning to his face with renewed resolution. But I must be practical as well. My position in society is precarious at best, a widow without fortune, with a reputation already questioned in certain circles. To remain here indefinitely without clear purpose or defined role would invite speculation that might harm both your standing and mine. And if such a role were defined, Edmund pressed, moving closer still, if there were a position at Ashbourne that both honoured your abilities and provided the security you deserve. Before she could respond, the door opened to admit Thomas, whose expression suggested he was well aware of having interrupted a significant moment. Forgive the intrusion, he said, glancing between them with barely concealed interest. I merely wish to inform you both that Mr. Hargrove's clerk has arrived with additional documents requiring review before morning. Edmund straightened, the spell of intimacy broken by this reminder of the practical world beyond the drawing-room's confines. Of course, I shall attend to them directly. As he moved toward the door, he paused beside Eleanor, his voice lowered for her ears alone. We shall continue this conversation upon your return from Portsmouth, if you are willing. Her gaze met his, steady and clear, despite the uncertainty their exchange had introduced. Yes, she replied simply. Upon my return. It was only as he followed Thomas toward the library, his mind already shifting toward the legal matters awaiting his attention, that Edmund realized what had just occurred. He had, for the first time in 4 years, begun to plan for a future that extended beyond mere survival, a future that, in his mind at least, included Eleanor Gray not as his nurse or even his friend, but as something far more integral to his renewed existence. The realization both exhilarated and terrified him. For to contemplate such possibilities was to risk disappointment, loss, the reopening of wounds so recently begun to heal. Yet as he settled at the library desk, preparing to confront the tangible evidence of betrayal and corruption that demanded his immediate attention, a deeper certainty took root within him, that whatever risks the future held, The alternative of continued isolation was no longer one he could bear to contemplate. The wax was red, the crest unmistakable. Spring came to Ashbourne Hall not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual awakening. Tentative buds unfurling on ancient oaks, tender shoots emerging from soil long dormant, birdsong returning to gardens that had known too many silent seasons. Within the great house, windows stood open to welcome the mild air, curtains stirring in breezes that carried the scent of renewal. In the east drawing-room, Edmund Valahurst stood before one such window, observing the activity on the lawn below. Workers moved purposefully across the grounds, carrying materials toward the stone outbuilding that was being transformed into the Ashbourne Infirmary. The project, begun in the depths of winter, had progressed steadily, despite challenges both expected and unforeseen. "The roof slates should be delivered by Thursday," Thomas Hale remarked, joining Edmund at the window. "Barring further delays, the structure will be weather-tight before month's end." Edmund nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "And the staffing arrangements?" "Progressing admirably. The physician from Harrogate has accepted our offer, and 2 nurses have been engaged on Mrs. Winter's recommendation. Both have experience with military casualties, which should serve them well in treating the various injuries common among agricultural workers." The mention of Mrs. Winters brought a thoughtful expression to Edmund's face. The Portsmouth widow's testimony had proven invaluable in the case against Lord Blackwood and Sir Alaric. Her late husband's careful documentation of the Crimean medical supply irregularities, preserved in letters she had kept hidden for years, had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to secure a legal victory that had reverberated through London society. "Have the quarterly payments been established for her?" Edmund inquired, though he knew Thomas would have attended to this detail with his customary thoroughness. "Indeed. Mrs. Winters and her son are now comfortably situated in the cottage near the village school. The boy shows considerable academic promise, I understand. Lady Miriam has taken a particular interest in his education." A comfortable silence fell between the 2 men, the friendship of their youth having deepened into something richer through the shared purpose of recent months. Thomas had postponed his return to Northumberland indefinitely, his presence at Ashbourne proving essential during the legal proceedings and subsequent reorganization of the estate's affairs. "And what of your own plans?" Edmund asked after a moment. "Surely your northern estate requires your attention as spring planting approaches." Thomas smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "My steward manages admirably in my absence. Besides, I find myself reluctant to depart before certain matters at Ashbourne reach their natural conclusion." Edmund raised an eyebrow, well aware of his friend's meaning. "You have become invested in more than agricultural outcomes, it seems." "Can you blame me?" Thomas countered good-naturedly. "After witnessing the remarkable transformation in both Ashbourne and its master over these past months, I confess I am eager to see how this particular season of renewal culminates." Before Edmund could formulate a suitably dignified response to this gentle provocation, the door opened to admit Lady Miriam, her expression unusually animated. "They have returned," she announced without preamble. "The carriage has just passed the north gate." Edmund felt a surge of anticipation that he made no attempt to conceal from these his closest confidants. "All is prepared?" "Everything is arranged as you requested," Miriam confirmed, a smile of quiet approval warming her features. "Though I maintain that such elaborate gestures hardly seem necessary given the circumstances." "Perhaps not necessary," Edmund conceded, straightening his already impeccable cravat, "but certainly fitting. Some occasions demand proper acknowledgement, regardless of their unconventional nature." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder, his gesture conveying both encouragement and affection. "Well said. Now, shall we proceed to the entrance hall to greet our returning travellers, or would you prefer a more private reunion?" The question gave Edmund pause. These past weeks of Eleanor's absence had been filled with activity: legal consultations, estate reorganization, infirmary planning. Yet beneath this practical busyness had run a current of anticipation so powerful it had occasionally threatened to overwhelm him. Their parting conversation in the drawing-room, with its delicate balance of what was spoken and what remained implied, had occupied his thoughts during quiet moments and sleepless nights. "I believe," he said slowly, "that I would prefer a moment of privacy before joining the general company. Would you be so kind as to direct Eleanor to the library upon her arrival? Explain that there are documents requiring her immediate attention." Miriam and Thomas exchanged a glance, in which amusement and affection were equally mingled. "Of course," his sister replied, "though I suspect she will see through such a transparent pretext immediately." "I am counting on her perspicacity," Edmund acknowledged with a small smile. "It has never failed to discern my true intentions, however inadequately expressed." With a final adjustment to his attire, Edmund made his way to the library, that space which had witnessed so many significant moments in his relationship with Eleanor, from their first tentative readings to the revelation of Sir Alaric's betrayal. The room had been prepared according to his instructions. A small fire burned in the grate despite the mild weather. Fresh flowers from the newly revived gardens adorned the tables, and upon the desk lay a single document, its red wax seal gleaming in the afternoon light. He had just positioned himself before the window, striving for a pose that suggested casual composure rather than the nervous anticipation he actually felt, when he heard the library door open behind him. He turned, and the sight of Eleanor in the doorway rendered all his carefully prepared words momentarily inaccessible. She wore a dress of deep blue, a departure from the grey garments that had been her uniform during their early acquaintance, and the colour lent a new vibrancy to her complexion. Her hair, arranged simply but with evident care, caught the sunlight streaming through the windows. But it was her expression that arrested him most completely, a mixture of pleasure, uncertainty, and something deeper that mirrored his own complex emotions. "Your Grace," she greeted him with a small curtsy. "Lady Miriam mentioned urgent documents requiring my attention." "Edmund," he corrected gently, moving toward her. "After all we have shared, surely we have earned the right to such informality, at least in private." A smile touched her lips. "Edmund," she amended, "though old habits of propriety are difficult to set aside entirely, as are old habits of isolation," he acknowledged, gesturing toward the chairs arranged before the fire. "Yet we have both demonstrated considerable capacity for change these past months, have we not?" Eleanor seated herself with her characteristic grace, her gaze taking in the carefully arranged room with evident appreciation. "Indeed. Ashbourne itself seems transformed, less a memorial to past sorrows and more a place of present purpose." "Your observation is apt, as always." Edmund took the chair opposite hers, close enough for intimate conversation, yet maintaining a respectful distance. "Ashbourne has awakened from a long dormancy, much like its master. Both transformations owe much to your influence." A faint colour rose in her cheeks at this direct acknowledgement. "You give me too much credit. The capacity for renewal was always present, merely awaiting the proper circumstances to manifest." "Perhaps," he conceded, "yet I cannot overlook the catalyst that precipitated these changes. Your voice, Eleanor, not merely the sound of it, though that has brought me immeasurable comfort, but the wisdom and honesty it has conveyed. You have reminded me of connections I had forgotten existed, obligations I had neglected, pleasures I had denied myself." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze holding hers with an intensity born of absolute conviction. "Before you arrived at Ashbourne, I existed rather than lived, a ghost haunting the corridors of my own house, as Miriam so accurately described me. You restored me not merely to physical health, but to engagement with life itself. That is a debt I can never adequately repay." Eleanor shook her head, her expression softening. "There is no debt, Edmund. Whatever comfort or perspective I may have offered came freely, without expectation of return." "I know," he replied simply. "That is precisely what renders it so precious." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with the weight of things not yet spoken. Edmund found himself studying the play of light across her features, the subtle indicators of emotion she had learned to read during their long evenings of companionship. "Your journey was successful?" he inquired at last, shifting to more neutral ground. "Most productive," she confirmed. "The School for War Widows' Children is now fully established, with funding secured for at least 5 years. Mrs. Winters has proven an exceptional administrator, bringing both compassion and practical wisdom to the venture. I am glad to hear it. The children of those who served deserve every advantage we can provide them." Eleanor nodded, her expression suggesting she understood the deeper significance behind his words, that in supporting this particular cause, he was honoring not only those lost in battle, but also her own personal history of loss and resilience. "Lady Miriam mentioned that the infirmary construction progresses well," she observed, glancing toward the window through which the activity was visible in the distance. "It does, though we have encountered some challenges with material supply. The roof slates in particular have proven difficult to procure in sufficient quantity. Yet you persevere," she noted with approval. "Obstacles do not deter you, as once they might have done." Edmund smiled, recognizing the gentle reference to his former habit of withdrawal when faced with difficulties. "I have had excellent examples of perseverance before me, yours not least among them." Another silence, this one more expectant. Edmund was acutely conscious of the document waiting on his desk, the purpose for which he had summoned her to this private meeting. Yet now that the moment had arrived, he found himself hesitating, not from doubt about his intentions, but from awareness of their significance. Eleanor seemed to sense his internal deliberation. "You mentioned documents requiring my attention," she prompted gently. "Yes," he acknowledged, rising and moving to the desk. "A single document, in fact. One that I hope you will consider with the same thoughtful attention you have given to all matters at Ashbourne." He retrieved the sealed paper and returned to stand before her, suddenly aware of the symbolic weight of his position. Not seated as her equal, but standing before her, the parchment extended like an offering. "Before you open it," he said quietly, "I wish to speak plainly about matters that have remained largely unspoken between us." Eleanor's expression grew serious as she gazed up at him, her hands folded in her lap, rather than reaching for the document he held. "When you first came to Ashbourne," Edmund continued, "you were engaged as my nurse, a professional relationship with clearly defined boundaries. Yet over these months those boundaries have shifted, have they not? Through our readings together, our conversations, our shared experiences during the investigation of Sir Alaric's dealings, we have become something more than patient and nurse, more even than casual acquaintances." "Yes," she agreed softly, "we have become friends, I believe." "Friends," he repeated, testing the word as though evaluating its adequacy. A precious designation, certainly. Yet I find myself wondering whether even that term fully encompasses what has developed between us. Edmund lowered himself to one knee before her chair, bringing their faces level, a gesture that eliminated the height difference that had symbolized their difference in station. "Eleanor Grey, you came to Ashbourne to care for my broken body, yet you have accomplished something far more profound. You have restored my capacity for human connection, for compassion, for hope." He extended the document toward her once more. "This paper contains a proposal, not a romantic one, for I would not presume upon your feelings in that regard without more direct encouragement than you have yet offered. Rather, it proposes a position here at Ashbourne that would allow you to remain indefinitely should you wish it." Eleanor accepted the document with visibly trembling hands. "What position?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Director of the Ashbourne Infirmary and School for Nurses," he replied. "A role that would utilize your medical knowledge, your compassion, and your administrative abilities. It would provide you with independent quarters in the East Wing, a generous stipend, and the authority to shape the institution according to your own vision of care." She stared at the unopened document, her expression a complex mixture of emotions Edmund could not fully interpret. "This is most generous," she said at last. "It is not generosity that motivates the offer," he clarified gently. "It is recognition of your exceptional abilities, combined with my profound desire that you remain at Ashbourne in whatever capacity would honor your dignity and independence." Eleanor broke the seal, her eyes scanning the contents rapidly. The document outlined exactly what Edmund had described, a position of genuine authority and independence, with compensation commensurate with her responsibilities. "This is a most carefully constructed proposal," she observed, looking up from the parchment. "You have anticipated many practical considerations. I have had considerable time to contemplate it during your absence," Edmund acknowledged, "though I confess that practical considerations were not my only motivation in drafting it." He took a deep breath, committed now to complete honesty. "Eleanor, I would be less than truthful if I did not acknowledge that my feelings for you have evolved beyond those appropriate to our original relationship. Your absence these past weeks has made clear to me how essential your presence has become to my well-being, not merely as a caregiver or companion, but as one whose perspective and character I have come to cherish." The word, inadequate though it seemed, hung in the air between them. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, a vulnerability in her expression that he had rarely glimpsed beneath her composed exterior. "I would not have you accept this position out of any sense of obligation," he continued quickly, "nor would I have you believe that your acceptance implies any expectation beyond the professional role described. Your continued presence at Ashbourne would be gift enough, in whatever capacity you choose to define it." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving between the document in her hands and Edmund's face. When she spoke at last, Her voice was steady, despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "When I came to Ashbourne," she began, "I believed my capacity for deep attachment had been buried alongside my husband and son. I had resigned myself to a life of service without expectation of personal fulfillment, beyond the satisfaction of duty well performed." She set the document aside carefully, her hands now free to clasp his, where they rested on the arm of her chair. "You have awakened something in me that I thought forever lost, a willingness to risk connection despite knowing its potential cost. Your kindness, your integrity, your courage in facing painful truths, these qualities have made you dear to me in ways I had not anticipated." Edmund felt a surge of hope so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. He tightened his grip on her hands, this simple contact more meaningful than any formal declaration. "Does this mean you will accept the position?" he asked when he had regained his composure. A small smile touched her lips. "I will accept the position because it offers meaningful work that aligns with my abilities and values. And I will accept the possibility of whatever else might develop between us, given time and patience and mutual respect." Edmund raised her hand to his lips in a gesture both formal and deeply intimate. "I can ask for nothing more than that possibility, Eleanor. The rest we shall discover together at whatever pace seems right to both of us." As he rose and helped her to her feet, their hands remained joined, a simple connection that seemed to Edmund more profound than any elaborate declaration. Through the library windows, sunlight streamed across the awakening gardens of Ashbourne, illuminating a landscape transformed by spring's gradual renewal. Within, two souls who had known profound loss stood together in quiet recognition of life's most unexpected gift, the courage to begin again. The document with its broken seal lay forgotten on the chair, not because its contents were unimportant, but because the true covenant between them required no parchment or wax to render it binding. It existed in the shared glance, the clasped hands, the mutual willingness to step beyond the safety of solitude into the uncertain territory of renewed connection. Outside the library door, the household continued its daily rhythms, servants passing with linens and tea trays, Thomas and Miriam discussing plans for the evening meal, distant hammers marking progress on the infirmary's construction. Life at Ashbourne flowed forward, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to unfold, stories yet to be written, healing yet to be completed. And at the center of this flowing current stood Edmund and Eleanor, no longer defined primarily by what they had lost, but by what they had found. In each other, in themselves, in the quiet courage required to acknowledge that even the deepest wounds may, in time, become the foundation for unexpected grace. As they moved toward the library door, prepared to rejoin the household and the practical matters awaiting their attention, Edmund paused, struck by a sudden thought. "There is one matter we have not discussed," he said, his tone deliberately light, despite the significance of the question. "If you are to remain at Ashbourne as the director of the infirmary, how shall you be addressed? Mrs. Gray seems overly formal for one who holds such an integral position within the household." Eleanor considered this, her head tilted in that thoughtful manner he had come to cherish. "Perhaps," she suggested with the ghost of a smile, "we might begin with Eleanor and see where time and circumstance lead us." "Eleanor," he repeated, savoring the sound of her name spoken openly, without qualification or constraint. "Yes, I believe that would be an excellent beginning." Hand in hand, they stepped from the library into the sunlit corridor beyond, their shadows merging on the polished floor as they moved forward together into the unwritten chapters of a story that had begun with a lonely duke, a widow's gentle voice, and the awakening of a desire not forbidden after all, but merely waiting for its proper season of fulfillment. In the depths of our greatest grief, we often build walls not just to keep pain out, but to keep ourselves in, prisoners of our own making. Yet healing rarely comes through isolation. It arrives through connection, through the courage to allow another soul to witness our brokenness without judgment. Edmund and Eleanor's journey reminds us that sometimes the most profound act of bravery is simply opening our door to another person's kindness, allowing their voice to penetrate the silence we've wrapped around ourselves like armor. True healing is not about forgetting our past, but about finding the courage to build a future that honors what we've lost, while embracing what might yet be. The greatest gift we can offer another person is not protection from pain, but companionship through it, a gentle hand that helps transform suffering into wisdom, isolation into connection, and grief into a deeper capacity for joy. If this story touched your heart, Please subscribe to our channel for more tales of healing, redemption, and the quiet courage that transforms lives. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Has a gentle voice ever awakened something in you that you thought was forever lost? Your stories of resilience and renewal inspire us all.